This recording is going to be of some of the highlights in Chapter 2. I do want to point out to all of you that you do need to read the entire chapter because I'm not going to cover everything in this lecture, but I do want to at least maybe cover some of the things that may be a little bit more confusing or you may need a little bit more guidance on. So this is just part of Chapter 2, and again, you do need to read to get the full content from this chapter. Okay, so some of the major focus found in Chapter 2 is going to be what are referred to as DRIs, or dietary reference intakes. And this is going to give you information about what you should consume, what happens if you consume too much, how much energy do you use. So we'll take a look at the different classifications that fall under this category of the DRI. So if we look at our 4 different sets of value for our dietary reference intakes, we could see that we have EARs, RDAs, AIs, and UL. And this really, what this refers to is just, what are you taking in? And some of these might sound familiar to you. Typically RDAs are something that sound familiar to people, the recommended amount that you should have each day. So we're going to look at this more in a chart form so that you can kind of see how these different things are related to one another. Okay, so it should be pretty obvious to everybody that not everyone is the same. So, while some of us, a sufficient amount of vitamin D might be relatively low, for other of us, we need to consume a higher level of vitamin D. So for that reason, we have a chart like this. And what we see on the left-hand side is the number of people. And on the bottom is the daily nutrient requirement. So whether we're talking about vitamin D, whether we're talking about calcium, it's how much is required. So we'll start off with the EAR. You could see that falls right in the middle there. So that curve that we see represents 100% of people, that entire curve from left to right, that bell shape. Well, up at the peak there, we have 50% of people. So what we're seeing there is, if everyone consumed, that particular amount of that nutrient, it would be considered adequate or good enough for 50% of the population. Some individuals, if we look at it, every person individually, some people would need less than that, and other people would need more than that, because again, we're all different as far as our needs go. The thing that's not listed on this page is the AI, or the adequate intake. If there is not enough information, the adequate intake is what we assume. And basically, if there just haven't been enough studies done to say, okay, how much of a nutrient is recommended, then we set the adequate intake, and we just assume that seems like if most people have this amount of this nutrient, it seems to be enough. The RDA is, taking that estimated average requirement and then adding some on top of that, so that about 97% of the population will meet its need consuming that amount. And again, the RDA, is going to be what's recommended for you. Again, you as an individual might need only half that amount or a quarter of that amount. But this is kind of our buffer zone, our safety zone, that's going to say chances are if you meet the RDA, you're going to fall within that 97% of the population and have plenty of that nutrient. The UL is that kind of upper level, that upper limit, and basically this is that level of toxicity, where if you have the UL on a daily basis over a long period of time, you can suffer from symptoms of toxicity, of getting way too much of that nutrient. So what this chart does is it just relates these different DRI values and kind of puts them together to hopefully give you a better idea of where these things fall. Now, when we talk about DRIs, there's 2 other, groups here. And this is about your energy intake, so what you're taking in. Your EERs, basically this is your energy intake in order to maintain your current weight. In other words, how many calories should you consume on a daily basis? So this is going to vary a lot depending on your age and your activity level, whether you're male or female, your height. So a lot of personal aspects to this to be able to establish this EER. And again, this just means how much energy do you use on a daily basis, and it will tell you how many calories you should consume in order to maintain your weight. The other one that we see here is the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges. In Chapter 1, you learn that your macronutrients are your carbs, your lipids, and your proteins. These are the things that give you your calories. So this is the range that you should be getting of each one of those things. So if you take your entire calorie intake for the day, how we could break those calories down. So for instance, if you have 2,000 calories recommended for you per day, a certain percentage of that should come from protein, a certain percentage from carbs, and a certain percentage from fat. Let's take a closer look at that. So the reason that we do this is that you don't want to get 100% of your calories just from carbohydrates or just from protein or just from fat. We know that having variety in our diet is very important, giving you the building blocks, giving you the different things that you need. So what's recommended here, your percentage of total calories, protein's pretty flexible, 10 to 35%, and that really depends on the individual. 45 to 65 from carbohydrates, so you should note that most of your calories, it's recommended, do come from carbohydrates. And then 20 to 35% of your calories are recommended to come from fat. Now, there are wise choices to make in each one of these categories. So your protein, lean proteins are always recommended. Your chicken and your fish. Your carbohydrates, it's recommended that you have high fiber versions of carbohydrates found in fruits and vegetables and whole grains instead of just having a lot of sugar and things like pop. And then when we talk about fat, we want to focus on, our good types of fat. So less saturated fat, less trans fat, and more of our unsaturated, our vegetable fats are really recommended here. So we'll get a little bit more into each one of those categories in future chapters as we talk about protein, carbs, and fat. So this chart just summarizes for us all of our DRIs. So the intakes as far as what you should be how much you're using or how much intake you should be doing. So your EAR, so how many calories you burn on a daily basis. Your RDA, the recommended amount. The adequate intake, we don't know enough about it, so we're going to assume that it's adequate. Your upper level, that's what you want to try to stay away from. Typically, you don't get that in a normal diet. Typically, your ULs are only reached once you are starting to take supplements, in particular if you're abusing supplements. If you say, okay, well, I'm supposed to have 1 calcium supplement a day and you take 5, that's when you can get into some of those dangerous levels. Your ER, how much energy or how many calories you burn on a daily basis. And then your AMDR, where those calories should come from. Now, if we look at healthy eating patterns, again, there's certain nutrients we want to focus on getting enough of, and then there's others that we want to try to, in a typical American diet, limit. So, for instance, typically most Americans fall short in their whole grains, vegetables, fruit, dairy, seafood, and the good types of oils. So, those are the things that we really want to focus on increasing to meet our goal. Other things that we want to be able to try to limit are things like our calories, bring those down. We want to be able to bring down our solid fats and added sugars, so things that are found in junk food and pop, try to bring those down. We want to try to reduce our sodium. In general, we get more than enough sodium and more than enough saturated fat. So those are the things we want to focus on trying to bring down. Now, there's been a lot, as you've read in your book, there's a big history as far as our food pyramid and food recommendations. So starting off very early with things like just breaking up food into food groups. Later on, we saw the food pyramid, and your first food pyramid that many of us, saw for a very, very long time, because it took them a while to change this to my pyramid, didn't look like this pyramid on this page. Instead, it was still pyramid shaped, but we separated it out from the bottom to the top. And at the bottom, it was recommended the things that you should consume most of, which were your good carbohydrates. Up above that are your fruits and vegetables. Above that, you had your protein and your dairy. And then up above that, you had your discretionary calories, oils, added fats, junk food, that kind of thing. And what that represented was the base meant that you should have more of those types of foods and food groups. And then at the top, those discretionary calories, you should have fewest of those. So it was a very broad, general guideline, focused mostly on children, really, just this idea of what types of foods you should be eating. Well, that got changed into what is known as My Pyramid or My Pyramid Plan. And this was an online program that you entered your age and your weight and your sex and all of that information in, and it separated these things out. So now the pyramid is separated a little bit differently. You could still see that we have our food groups here, our grains, our veggies, our fruits, our milk, and our meat and beans, but they're separated into little smaller triangles. That little yellow line in there that's not labeled in the bottom, those are your oils and your fats and your junk food, your discretionary calories. This changed. So several years ago, we changed over to MyPlate, and the website for this is choosemyplate.gov. So again, what we're seeing here is, an online program giving people access and a general guideline. Now, instead of being a pyramid where we kind of have to extrapolate the information and say, okay, how much of each should I have? Here we're focusing on a plate, and this is focusing really on meal times. So it separates your plate into fruits and vegetables, grains, protein, and then you have a cup of dairy on the side. And the big focuses with My Plate, of course, is how to set up a plate, which I think is a lot easier for a lot of children to understand, especially when you start learning this very early. Focusing on balancing your calories, so avoiding oversized portions. Making sure your portions are appropriately, proportioned to one another. So half of your plate being fruits and vegetables, really focusing on those food groups, getting your grains or your whole grains, and then also making sure you focus on foods to reduce. Now, keep in mind, My Plate's not perfect. It gives you a general idea. But you can also abuse the system if you're not, if you're not as a child taught properly how to, fill your plate up. We could technically say the dairy could be a milkshake, the protein could be fried chicken fingers, your grains or your carbs here could be French fries. Your vegetables can be something that's loaded with, butter. And your fruits could be, canned fruits with lots and lots of extra sugar added in like a syrup form. So when we look at something like this, it's not just about how to split up your plate, but also how to make responsible choices to fill that plate. So that's really important here with Choose My Plate. My Plate does give you specific recommendations for each one. And when you go into My Plate, which is part of your assignment this week, when you go into My Plate, you'll see the specific recommendations for you, for your age group, for your sex, for, your level of activity. All of that will be calculated into My Plate. So, and there's specific recommendations. Not only should you have vegetables, but you should have variety to those vegetables. So simply having, a potato every single day is not going to cut it. You want to have variety here. Your grains, you should focus on whole grains. With fruits, even though fruit juices do focus on, giving you that fruit category, it's better to have whole fruits because you're going to get added things like the phytochemicals and the fiber that's added in with those fruits. Dairy is focusing on calcium-rich food. So even if you don't have milk or technically dairy, having other options. So having, soy milk or rice milk or almond milk, or really, if you're having yogurt, any kind of dairy there to really get that calcium that you need along with a lot of protein. And then lastly, your protein there, instead of focusing on more fried foods or red meats that have a lot of saturated fat in them, focusing more on those lean proteins, the fish and the chicken. So my plate definitely emphasizes, having proportionality. So instead of covering, half your plate with, French fries, you realize maybe a smaller portion of that, and you should include your fruits and vegetables. Having a lot of variety. So not having the same thing every day, but focusing on a lot of different variety. Moderation by choosing better choices, by choosing appropriate amounts, and then by choosing better options within each one of those groups. And then really focusing on those nutrient dense foods, those foods that are high in vitamins and minerals but lower in calories. Okay, so the next part of this chapter is going to focus on food labeling. So you notice, you go to the store, hopefully you look at food labels, you've got a general idea what these things are, and anything that's packaged has to have that nutrition facts panel and an ingredient list. So we'll take a look at some of the things that are included on these food labels. Okay, so here's what we have in our textbook. It's your general nutrition fact panel, and this tells you all of the things that are required. One of the things that we could focus on here is, of course, looking at the serving size. Whenever you're purchasing something and you're, watching your calories, or you're watching your sodium, or trying to increase fiber, whatever your goal is, by looking at those nutrition facts, you want to pay attention to serving size. Now, there are pretty standard serving sizes for certain types of food. For instance, with this, we want to be able to compare foods equally. So if you're in the ice cream aisle and you want to pick out ice cream, but you want to find, kind that's not too high in fat or in calories, you want to be able to look at the nutrition fact panels for two different products side by side and get, similar results. So if we look at ice cream, and one ice cream company uses a quarter of a cup as their serving size, and another one uses 2 cups as their serving size, when you look at things like calories and fat and all of these other things, they're not going to match up. They're not going to be very easy to compare. First, you're going to have to do some math, and then look at your serving sizes, and then multiply. So these are meant to be very easy to read and easy to compare products. So serving sizes are generally standardized for different types of food. You've got to be able to, within this nutrition fact panel, not only list the specific amounts, but also the percent daily value. Now, if you've read one of these things before, you know that it's based on a 2,000 calorie diet. And if you've looked at all into your calculations or worked with iProfile yet, you know that your specific recommendations are different than 2,000. It's very rare for someone to fall right at 2,000. Again, depending on your age and your activity level, your sex, your height, your weight, all of that will play a role in how many calories are recommended for you on a daily basis. Yours might be 1,500. Yours might be 3,500. Again, there's a lot of variation there. But if we base this on a 2,000 calorie diet, the percent daily value gives us a general amount. So it's meant to be an easy to read, easy to compare amount on the label. So we know something gives us 18% of our total fat, and we compare that to another product that gives us 25% of our total fat. It gives us a very easy way to compare things. Now we could see, of course, the breakdown, and here you could see the things that are listed first are the things that should be limited. Your fat, saturated fat, trans fat, cholesterol, sodium tend to be things that we get more than enough of in our American diet, so those things are listed first as those things we should pay particular attention to, trying to bring down. There's also the list of things given there in green that show us the amounts of nutrients that tend to be low for the average person, and those are the things we should focus on bringing up. So if something has a good amount of fiber, you can look at that label and say, oh, good, this is something that I want to increase. Same thing with your vitamins and your minerals. The last thing that we find on this food label is the ingredient list, and these are in order by weight. So most of this product that we're seeing here, the mac and cheese, is the enriched macaroni product. And then it gives in parentheses what makes up those macaroni noodles. Then the cheese sauce mix and what makes that up. And again, even in parentheses, those things are listed in order of weight, how much they are using and putting into those products. So that ingredient list at the bottom is required for foods with more than one ingredient. So this is really good for people with allergies, if you're trying to, not have something in your diet, or anybody who's trying to avoid certain ingredients. So if you're vegan and you're trying to exclude animal products, maybe you're concerned about the amount of high fructose corn syrup you're consuming in your diet. If you look at wheat bread, sometimes high fructose corn syrup might be the second or third ingredient right after flour. That means there's an awful lot of high fructose corn syrup or added sugars into that product, and it may be something that you choose to avoid. Another thing we could find with food labeling is nutrient content claims. And that is talking about, something very particular that a food may or may not have, that could be of interest to consumers. So, you could talk about here fat-free, or sugar-free, or cholesterol-free. There are, certain characteristics that have to be followed in order to be able to use that word free on the product, because of course if it has nothing of that, you can use that amount, or if there's just a very, very small amount. So for instance, fat-free can be used even if there is a small amount of fat in that product, 0.5 grams per serving. Something to keep in mind if you're trying to limit your fat, is that if you eat a lot of servings of a particular food, that 0.5 grams does add up. On labels, you can sometimes find health claims, and these are things that have to be supported by scientific evidence. There has to be studies out there, and they have to be good studies. And if there's even emerging evidence, but it's not, really supported very well, you can qualify health claims. Some studies have shown would be a qualifying statement. Another one we could find as a qualified statement: 4 grams of soluble fiber from oatmeal daily in a diet low in saturated fat and cholesterol may reduce the risk. So we're using the word may reduce the risk of heart disease. We're not saying this is guaranteed to do it. It's just saying that there's a possibility that it could. So this is kind of your disclaimer. So you could see on there, big oatmeal helps reduce cholesterol, and then they've got that disclaimer on there saying, yeah, if you also have a diet low in saturated fat and cholesterol. But if you're eating a lot of saturated fat, lots of cholesterol, the oatmeal can only do so much for you. So it's not a cure-all. Lastly here, if we're talking about food labeling, it's important for you to be able to understand how you can make some calculations. So if a certain product has a serving size of 1 cup and the servings per package is 4, we know that the entire package gives you 4 cups of the product. Now we can also look at things like those daily values, those things that are recommended for, 2,000 calorie diet. If one serving contains 10% of a daily value of saturated fat, if you consume the entire package, how much saturated fat would you consume? The answer would be 40%. With sodium, if we did the same thing, and we ate that entire package, you'd have 120% of the daily value. So you'd go over the recommended amount for your entire day by consuming this entire package. If we look at serving sizes, one big thing to look at is if you eat cereal in the morning, the serving size is often anywhere from a half a cup, sometimes up to a cup. But if you look at the amount that you actually consume or ever measure it out, most people consume more than 1 cup of cereal per day. So if you're doing those kinds of calculations, looking at the added sugars or looking at your calories, it's important to keep in mind that serving size doesn't always mean the amount that we actually consume.